Boarding the Titanic in 1912 was the absolute peak of high society glamour. The promise of a flawless crossing created an aura of near absolute perfection. But let's lay our cards on the table. What if, in the midst of all that breathtaking refinement, you discovered that a right as basic as a hot bath wasn't guaranteed? It sounds almost like a joke today, doesn't it? But the behind-the-scenes reality of that steel giant was a bitter pill to swallow. While Gilded Age tycoons stretched their legs in lavish private tubs, the scene down in the lower decks was a grueling test of patience. The overwhelming majority had to face soul-crushing lines, strictly clocked time slots, and the constant, gnawing uncertainty of even getting to wash up that day. The naked truth. The ship was a ruthless mirror of the world outside. Aboard the Titanic, the water simply didn't flow the same way for everyone. When it came down to it, the way you took a bath revealed exactly who you were. Before we dive deeper, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching this documentary from. The RMS Titanic was never, not even in its earliest shipyard blueprints, just a means of transportation crossing the freezing Atlantic. If we take a closer look through the lens of history, we'll see that at its core, it was a floating, breathing portrait of society in 1912. A perfect microcosm. A place where the strict rules of etiquette, the rigid financial divides, and the old-world customs were boxed up and shipped out to the open sea. Aboard that colossal machine, over 2,200 souls breathed and lived realities so absurdly far apart, they barely seemed to be sailing on the same ship. And don't kid yourself into thinking this invisible wall between passengers was just about untamed luxury, tailor-made suits, or dinners washed down with French champagne. It ran way deeper than that. The real divide, the one people felt quite literally on their skin, was about access to the most rudimentary, bare-bones necessities imaginable. And that included a detail that today, for any of us, sounds like the most everyday thing in the world: taking a good, warm bath. For us, walking into the bathroom and turning the hot water knob is almost an automatic reflex at the end of a long day, isn't it? But walking the endless corridors of that steel behemoth, it was a totally different ballgame. Did everybody actually have the right and the privilege to wash up every single day? Who were the lucky few who had endless hot water pouring out without a care in the world? And on the flip side of the coin, who had to grit their teeth, brave massive lines, and fight for elbow room just to scrub the salt off their skin and feel human? That's exactly where our journey today takes a deeper turn. If you're the kind of person who likes to scratch past the surface and go way beyond what Hollywood has shown us on the silver screen, you're in the right place. Today, we're kicking open a door that most prefer to keep firmly shut. We're investigating the gritty, unseen truth of a rarely talked about subject that exposes the raw reality of life on board. The baths on the Titanic. And before we head down into the decks and uncover how this whole gearworks of soap and water operated, do yourself a favor and subscribe to the channel right here and smash that like button. It takes just a second, but it gives us the fuel we need to keep rescuing these fantastic, time-forgotten stories, crafted with care, especially for you. Settle in, because this story starts on the upper decks, and what you're about to see will completely shatter the image you had of Gilded Age luxury. To grasp the true magnitude of what it meant to sit at the absolute top of the Titanic's food chain, we need to flex our imaginations and wipe modern conveniences from our minds. Rewind the tape back to 1912. Back then, mankind's relationship with daily hygiene was entirely different. Having a full indoor bathroom, complete with plumbing and gushing hot water, was already an absurd luxury for a tiny fraction of the privileged elite back on dry land. Now imagine pulling off that impossible feat in the middle of the hostile North Atlantic. That's why, in the highly coveted first class, taking a bath was never treated as a rushed morning routine. Far from it. Up there, getting clean was an intimate gala event, custom designed to stroke the egos of the global financial elite. We're talking about the most exclusive, astronomically expensive cabins on the ocean liner, like the legendary Parlor Suites, occupied by heavy hitters whose personal fortunes could easily bankroll small nations. In these ultra-high-end suites, the lucky few found a perk practically unheard of in the history of seafaring: entirely private bathrooms. And don't picture some cramped, uncomfortable closet. Those rooms looked like they'd been teleported straight out of a European palace. They were majestic spaces, loaded with heavy, gleaming porcelain tubs, elegant sinks with solid brass fixtures, and flawless decor that rivaled the finest, most historic hotels in Paris. The whole idea was to make the millionaire completely forget he was adrift at sea. But what really made jaws drop, and what crowned the Titanic as the ultimate pinnacle of naval technology, was the colossal engineering behind all this comfort. For a lord to simply turn a dial and get steaming hot, fresh water at his beck and call, a formidable system was grinding away in the dark, beating heart of the ship, right beneath the feet of high society. The Titanic's monstrous boilers weren't just burning coal to turn the massive propellers. They were powering a complex web of thermal plumbing, pumping that heated water vertically, straight into the elite suites. It was human genius working in overdrive to ensure the cream of civilization could soak in aromatic oils, completely shielded from the biting, freezing cold outside. But right here is where our story takes a fascinating twist. We have this habit of lumping all of first class into the same golden box of privilege, assuming it was all smooth sailing for anyone who bought that ticket. But there was a peculiar catch that most people completely ignore. Not all first-class passengers had the luxury of a private bathroom. Can you believe that? Men of immense wealth often realized that to get clean, they'd have to step out of their dazzling staterooms and walk down the hall. Yeah, you heard that right. It just goes to show that even in the epicenter of absolute unmatched luxury, a rigid social hierarchy held strong. Because, against all odds, even inside the bubble of luxury, there were levels. As we just saw, lacking a private bathroom wasn't the end of the world, but it did beg an obvious question. Where did the vast majority of first-class passengers go when it was time to scrub up? The answer was down the ship's corridors, in what they called shared bathing facilities. But hold your horses. When we hear the word shared today, we instantly picture a dingy gym locker room, right? Wipe that image from your mind. On the Titanic, sharing a bathroom still meant soaking in an atmosphere of pure refinement, setting a bar far, far higher than anything the common man experienced on dry land. These collective spaces for the elite were built to drop jaws. Picture incredibly spacious, immaculately ventilated rooms with a constant, crisp scent of cleanliness, where the fresh sea breeze seemed to perfectly blend with fine soaps and wildly expensive bath oils. Massive, solid porcelain tubs gleamed under soft, warm lighting, while stacks of plush, heavily starched white towels sat completely untouched. But the real game changer wasn't just the hardware. It was the human touch. Believe it or not, taking a bath in this part of the ship came with highly personalized service. You didn't have to lift a finger to scrub your own tub, perfectly mix the hot and cold water, or clean up the mess afterward. There was an entire squad of bath stewards, staff rigorously trained to the exact standards of Europe's top butlers, whose sole mission in life was to draw your bath at the precise temperature you demanded. And if the goal was to elevate personal hygiene to a high society social event, the Titanic had an ace up its sleeve that would make modern five-star resorts green with envy: the legendary Turkish bath complex. Tucked away on F deck, this space was worlds away from just being a spot to wash off the soot of travel. It was a bona fide oasis of relaxation, an ultra-premium spa hidden deep in the belly of the ocean liner. Elite passengers stepped into an exotic world, richly decked out in Moorish tiles, bronze lanterns, lavish loungers, and rooms heated to varying degrees of intensity. You had everything from thick, heavy steam rooms to bracing, ice-cold showers. Down there, the simple act of bathing melted effortlessly into quiet business deals. The thick smoke of fine cigars and the hushed whispers of high society. In that magical environment, a bath wasn't just a daily chore. It was an untouchable pillar of the wealthy lifestyle. Everything sounds absolutely perfect and unshakable, doesn't it? A true distant dream. But this is where things start to get a bit more real, and the magic suffers its first scratch. Because even at this stratospheric level of wealth, access to all this comfort wasn't exactly an open house. The system demanded discipline. Even the most powerful man on board still had to bow to the rules of etiquette, advance bookings, and strict schedules. A passenger had to schedule his time with the bath steward and cross his fingers that the book wasn't already full. And it's exactly this little need for organization on the millionaire's deck that leads us to an inevitable realization. If life already imposed rules, elegant lines disguised as appointments, and limited time slots for the masters of the universe, what in the world was happening a few decks down, far away from the gleam of the crystal chandeliers? Stepping down the Titanic's hierarchy is, in a way, taking a fascinating journey straight into the heart of the emerging middle class of 1912. When we leave behind the heavy oak doors, the fine woods, and the crystal chandeliers of first class and enter the domain of second class, the atmosphere changes almost instantly. The extravagant opulence, that unchecked flaunting of wealth that bordered on the absurd and served purely to stroke the tycoons' egos, is left at the door. In its place, a visibly simpler, more contained, focused, and down-to-earth experience takes the stage. But don't rush to feel sorry for this crowd. By the moral, social, and structural standards of the time, traveling in the Titanic's second class was a massive achievement, offering a level of comfort that many of the teachers, merchants, and white-collar professionals on board had never experienced in their entire lives. But let's get to what we really care about today. What was it actually like for this massive chunk of the floating population when it was time to strip down and face the water? The first major reality check compared to the millionaires upstairs was blunt, straight, and to the point. In second class, the word privacy, at least when it came to the sacred moment of bathing, simply did not exist in the dictionary. There wasn't the slightest trace, not even the most remote possibility, of private bathrooms attached to the cabins. No passenger, no matter how successful they were in their career back on dry land, had the privilege of rolling out of bed straight into their own steaming tub. If you wanted to wash up, the rule was universal, egalitarian, and non-negotiable. Grab your towel, tuck your clean clothes under your arm, leave the quiet comfort of your cabin, walk down the long, bustling corridors, and use the strictly shared bath and toilet facilities. Sounds like a splash of cold water in the middle of the North Atlantic. Well, believe it or not, that wasn't exactly the case. This is exactly where the ship flexed its true technological muscle, its massive and undeniable engineering trump card. It turns out that, unlike almost all other commercial ships crossing the oceans in often precarious conditions at the turn of the century, the company behind the Titanic decided to truly push the envelope. They offered these passengers something that left a lot of people in awe. Top-of-the-line plumbing, reliable running water, and, brace yourself, actual showers. It might seem like no big deal to us, having grown up taking daily showers and seeing it as the most mundane thing in the universe. But over 100 years ago, global culture was almost entirely geared toward the long, slow soak in a bathtub. Having continuous streams of water pouring over your head in a naval setting during an ocean crossing was considered a formidable breakthrough, a glaring symbol of modernity swallowing up the old customs of the Victorian era. The setup for these travelers was so impressive, so beautifully finished, polished, and efficient, that many historians confidently state an undeniable truth. The second-class accommodations and bathrooms on the Titanic blew many respected hotels on dry land right out of the water, whether on the busy streets of London or in New York. The corridors were meticulously lined with gleaming linoleum. The white ceramic sinks shone under the electric lights, and the dominant smell was high-quality soap mixed with a relentless cleaning routine kept up by the crew. That proud middle class felt like they were living the ultimate American dream, enjoying state-of-the-art hygiene as they crossed the freezing waters toward a new life. Their dignity, at least according to the advertising brochures, was completely guaranteed. The feeling of being in a modern floating hotel was practically undeniable for anyone walking those halls. Everything seemed to run like a well-oiled machine, a flawless Swiss watch, and the illusion of absolute comfort held up almost perfectly most of the time. After all, you've got abundant water, top-tier facilities, and a dedicated crew looking after your area. What could possibly go wrong in such a promising scenario? This is exactly where our story takes a turn, and we start to understand the hidden cost of this voyage. Because, as with any human endeavor that has to manage massive crowds of people in an enclosed space, the math is usually a pretty cruel mistress. Having shiny, modern facilities is wonderful, sure, but the real trial by fire isn't in the beauty of the imported tiles. It's in the dreaded rush hour. And despite all this undeniable, highly publicized progress, there were still serious, uncomfortable limitations. And it's right here, in the heart of the ship, that the five-star hotel charm starts giving way to the cold, hard math. Remember how we just talked about the marvel of modern tiles and showers? Right. The big problem with having such a formidable setup is that it has to handle the demand. And in second class, there were considerably fewer bathrooms compared to the massive number of people occupying those decks. When you have hundreds of souls all wanting to use the same amenity at the exact same time, the equation only has one inevitable outcome: the good old-fashioned waiting line. It was exactly the kind of situation we might call a first-world problem today. Picture the scene. You, a respectable gentleman, used to a certain level of order in your own home, wake up fully intending to take that refreshing shower before breakfast. But the moment you step into the hallway, you run face first into a line of other passengers who had the exact same brilliant idea, all clutching their towels. There was no pulling rank or demanding privileges here, because on this part of the deck, everybody was literally and figuratively in the same boat. Passengers had no choice but to swallow their pride, practice their patience, and strictly adapt to the schedules and availability of the moment. Taking a bath was no longer a spontaneous whim. It became a strategic mission. You had to calculate the best time, dodge peak hours, and pray the water was still hot when your turn finally came around. After all, the clock spared no one. And that brings us to a detail that shocks a lot of people today. After all, we're the generation that takes 2 showers a day in the middle of summer. For that proud middle class of 1912 aboard the most famous ship in the world, getting a daily bath simply wasn't guaranteed. Especially during the busiest times, like the mornings before heading up to the promenade deck, or the hours right before dinner. The traffic in the hallways made the mission almost impossible for anyone not willing to kill a good chunk of their day planted outside a bathroom door. Many ended up settling for the small wash basins in their cabins just to get by with the basics, washing their face and hands, taking a quick sponge bath, and leaving the full soak for the next day. The sweet illusion that modernity would solve the problem of physical space completely fell apart. But let's be fair to history here. Despite the rush, the lines, and the occasional daily frustrations, the level of hygiene provided was still stupendously good for the standards and customs of the time. Nobody was on the verge of a sanitary collapse. Clean water was there, the facilities were kept spotless by a dedicated crew, and the towels were swapped out with the finest British rigor. It was a highly comfortable life, built so these people would feel properly respected and well taken care of during the crossing. However, it was a heavily regulated comfort, a pleasant experience without a doubt, but totally devoid of any unchecked luxury or excess perks. Life there operated within boundaries extremely well defined by the norms of the era. And that forces us to face an inevitable question that completely flips the script on what we thought about life on board. If for this class, who already enjoyed a solidly respectable financial status, the social rules were so rigid, and simply getting access to hot water required so much diplomacy and hallway hustle. What do you think was happening much further down, hidden deep in the dark steel hull, where the overwhelming majority of passengers were crammed together praying for a miracle? If second class already required a certain level of finesse to secure your daily hygiene, now we need to walk down the heavy iron staircases, leave the natural sunlight behind, and enter the deepest bowels of the ship. When we step into third class, that vast, noisy area the shipping lines of the day often called steerage, reality kicks the door down with overwhelming force. Down here, my friends, that Hollywood glamour stayed locked away on the upper decks. The tone of the conversation changes radically, and luxury gives way to the harsh, raw law of math and survival. If at the top of the ship a bath was treated as a refined social event, and in the middle it was seen as a modern convenience, down at the bottom, the name of the game was pure, dry, bare-bones functionality. To kick things off and lay our cards on the table, you need to completely forget any romantic daydreams about exclusive tubs, gleaming porcelain tiles, or stewards waiting at your door with plush towels. For the overwhelming majority of those thousands of immigrants and blue-collar workers crammed into the tight lower decks, dreaming of privacy when it was time to strip down and wash was literally a pipe dream. The available bathrooms were terrifyingly limited. And when I say limited, I'm talking about a ratio that would make anyone today pull their hair out. Picture the scene. Just a tiny handful of sanitary units expected to handle a restless crowd of over 700 souls. Obviously, the math never added up. The ship's engineering didn't design those spaces with relaxation or hotel-like comfort in mind. The absolute focus was solely on keeping basic public health under control. But let's hold our horses. Before we paint a picture of a horror movie set or a scene of utter misery, We have to be fair to history and look closely at the context of the world in 1912. As absurd as it seems to our modern eyes, even down there, deep in its vibrating steel hull, the Titanic represented an incredible technological leap. If you could ask a humble immigrant who had crossed the ocean in old, rotting, overcrowded boats years prior, they'd tell you this steel giant was actually a fabulous palace. You know why? Because against all odds and despite the inevitable lines, the Titanic finally offered indoor plumbing with running water and, a crucial detail, strictly gender-segregated bathrooms. That guaranteed a bare minimum of decency and modesty for the mothers and daughters of those families. For a lot of these simple folks, coming from rural villages that didn't have a drop of running water, functional sinks were a spectacle of modernity. The conditions were light years ahead of the older ships of the era. The basics were there, delivered in a rough but honest way. But there's a huge catch. The problem is, when you pack in a mass of people desperately searching for a future, separated from extreme wealth by mere sheets of metal, life's priorities drastically shift. And that brings us to a harsh, often forgotten truth about the daily grind down below. For many third-class passengers, the rawest, most honest reality is that a full-body bath, that long daily soak we consider a non-negotiable right of modern life, simply wasn't part of their routine. And mind you, this wasn't just about the limited infrastructure forced on them by the ship's gears. It was a massive cultural gap and a stark difference in basic life priorities. Put yourself in their shoes for a minute. When you board carrying absolutely everything you own stuffed into one or two battered canvas bags, with your heart burning with the hope of restarting your family's story from scratch in an unknown country, your vital concerns change overnight. The absolute priority wasn't smelling like fine French soap or wearing fresh clothes every single day. The priority was, for crying out loud, braving the freezing crossing. The ultimate focus was the journey toward the promise of a new life in America. In this landscape of absolute uncertainty, hygiene was viewed through the pragmatic lens of someone just trying to survive to see tomorrow. Now, for those brave souls who, against all odds, ventured to keep up a stricter washing routine down below, the daily challenge was jaw-dropping. Remember that terrifying ratio I mentioned earlier? Yeah. Facing the bottleneck of shared bathrooms deep in the Titanic's foundations required monumental patience and a tremendous ability to adapt. There was zero room for extreme modesty or impatience. Silent lines snaked through the long steel corridors, and access to that highly coveted hot water, that mundane comfort flowing freely in the millionaire suites, reached them with the scarcity of gold dust. It was an exhausting, often frustrating battle. Because of this logistical nightmare, the most common workaround was getting creative. Many passengers just settled for the bare minimum, washing their faces, arms, and hands in the cramped sinks of their overcrowded cabins, saving the heavy-duty, full-body scrubbing for the blessed day they finally stepped foot on dry land. Still, as contradictory as it might sound to our 21st century mindset, we have to give credit where credit is due. Even running into this maze of restrictions that anyone today would call a total nightmare, the Titanic was genuinely seen by these humble families as a formidable step up. If you weighed it against the old immigrant ships of the 19th century, where the air was thick, sickly, and there wasn't even a shred of sanitary decency, the White Star Line's third class was seen almost as a palace of metal. There was electric light piercing the darkness, corridors constantly swept by the crew, and a real, honest attempt to offer dignity to the poorest on board. However, the massive invisible barrier separating the decks, that never vanished. It remained glaringly and painfully obvious, even in the simplest, most everyday details imaginable. The exact same engineering marvel that heated the exotic Turkish baths of a billionaire industrialist didn't offer the same ease to heat the water of an Irish worker just looking to earn a living. It's this brutal contrast, embedded right in the spine of that steel behemoth, that makes us look way past the luxury and the silk dresses. And it's exactly this harsh realization that prepares us to wrap up our journey. When it all comes down to it, when we take a cold, hard look at this whole machine, we realize that taking a bath on the Titanic was far from just a routine habit. It was, in reality, a crystal-clear, ruthless reflection of how society was built back then. While high society heavy hitters soaked in almost unimaginable comfort, drowning in Turkish baths and exclusive perks, hundreds of dreamers on the lower decks had to purely survive on the basics. And the craziest part of it all? That humble crowd down below still threw their hands up to the heavens, counting that cramped space as the greatest opportunity of their lives. It's a hell of a reality check. On a single ship, floating all alone in the vast, freezing ocean, three completely different worlds coexisted, separated by nothing more than a few steel plates and heavy wooden doors. And maybe, folks, it's exactly this social microcosm that makes the legend of the Titanic so eternally fascinating to all of us, even after over a century resting at the bottom of the sea. The true magnetism of this story isn't just held up by the icy tragedy that dragged it down in the dead of night, but above all, by the deep human experiences hidden right between the lines, in the small, everyday details of life on board. Because when the lights go out, the greatest lesson left behind is this. Even in something as simple and mundane as taking a bath, an entire story was being told, revealing exactly where everyone belonged in that world. If this journey through the forgotten behind the scenes of the past made you look at history through a different lens and touched you in some way, I ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It's through this simple gesture that we secure our ticket to keep exploring the many eras of mankind together, rescuing these lost memories. Take care, and I'll see you on our next voyage.